I used to believe that the most dangerous words a man could say were threats, promises, or lies, but I was wrong. Because the words that truly destroy a person are much quieter, and the night Adrian Blake said them, my entire world collapsed without anyone else even noticing. I don't want her. I never did. His voice was calm, almost bored, the kind of voice a man uses when discussing something trivial, like the weather or a business contract, and the men around him nodded, as if the statement meant nothing more than a minor inconvenience in the middle of a long evening. I stood on the other side of the half-open study door, frozen, my fingers still wrapped around the silver tray I had been carrying down the hallway, listening to the soft clink of glasses and the low hum of conversation inside the room. The Blake estate was quiet at night, the kind of quiet that felt expensive, with tall windows looking out over acres of dark lawn and the faint glow of security lights stretching across the property like silent guardians. I had lived there for 3 months, long enough to know the sound of every floorboard, long enough to learn when Adrian returned from his meetings and when the staff disappeared into the back hallways, but not long enough to understand the man himself. Our marriage had been arranged with the kind of efficiency only powerful families could manage, signatures placed on paper, a brief ceremony, and then a new life that felt less like a romance and more like stepping into someone else's carefully organized world. Adrian Blake was known throughout the city for many things: wealth, influence, an intelligence that made people lower their voices when he entered a room, but warmth had never been one of them. Still, I had believed something foolish at the beginning, something hopeful, the way people sometimes believe that proximity can soften distance, that patience can grow into affection if given enough time. So I cooked breakfast when he was home in the mornings, even when he barely touched the coffee. I asked the housekeeper about her grandson and helped the groundskeeper carry supplies across the wide driveway when the summer heat climbed past 90 degrees. Small things, quiet things, the kind of things no one important ever notices. Inside the study, one of Adrian's associates laughed softly, a low sound of agreement, and Adrian spoke again, his tone steady, confident, final. The marriage was necessary. Nothing more. Necessary. The word drifted down the hallway and settled in my chest like a weight. I realized then that my hands were trembling slightly, the polished tray rattling against the glasses I had been bringing to the staff kitchen, and I tightened my grip to stop the sound before anyone inside the room heard it. I should have walked away immediately, should have gone back down the hall and pretended I had never heard those words, but my feet refused to move, as if some stubborn part of me still hoped he would say something different next. Something kinder, something human. But the conversation inside the room moved on, voices turning toward business and numbers and things that mattered far more to men like Adrian Blake than a quiet woman standing in a hallway with a tray in her hands. After a moment, I stepped back carefully, easing the door closed with a soft click, the sound barely louder than a breath. The corridor stretched long and silent in front of me, the marble floor reflecting the dim lights overhead, and I stood there for several seconds before forcing myself to walk again. My shoes made almost no noise against the polished surface, the same way they always had, but everything felt different now, as if the house itself had shifted around me. I had thought I understood my place in this world. I had thought patience might change something. But as I reached the end of the hallway and placed the tray down on the kitchen counter, a quiet realization settled over me like cold air through an open window. Adrian Blake didn't want me. And the most painful part was that he had never even tried to hide it. I learned very quickly that the Blake estate had its own rhythm, a quiet routine that never appeared in newspapers or business reports, but ruled every hour of the day with the same precision Adrian Blake used when running his empire. The mornings began early because sunlight poured through the tall windows facing the east lawn, stretching across the marble floors like golden water, and the kitchen staff always arrived before 7 with the smell of coffee and fresh bread filling the wide halls. I used to sit near the window with a cup of tea, watching the gardeners move slowly across the acres of green grass while the security vehicles rolled silently along the distant gates, their headlights fading as the sun climbed higher. It was a strange life for someone like me, because 3 months earlier I had been living in a small apartment above a bookstore in Queens where the radiator rattled every winter night, and the street outside smelled like roasted peanuts from a corner cart. My life had been simple then. Not easy, but understandable. The kind of life where you knew exactly why you woke up every morning. That changed the day our families sat across from each other at a long polished table and decided that a marriage would solve problems that money alone could not fix. No one asked me what I wanted, and no one asked Adrian either. The agreement was explained with calm voices and polite smiles, as if it were the most reasonable arrangement in the world. Our families had known each other for years. There were partnerships, investments, connections that stretched across cities and industries. A marriage would make those connections permanent, stable, untouchable. I remember looking at Adrian during that meeting, expecting anger or resistance, or at least a moment of hesitation. But he simply leaned back in his chair, his expression calm, his eyes thoughtful, like a man reviewing the terms of a contract he had already decided to accept. That was the moment I realized something important about him. Adrian Blake did not waste energy fighting battles that could be solved with logic. If something was necessary, he accepted it and moved forward. Our wedding happened 2 weeks later in a private ceremony with fewer than 30 people present. The photographs from that day still sit in a silver frame near the grand staircase. Every time I pass them, I see the same image. Adrian standing tall in a dark suit, composed and distant, while I stand beside him holding a bouquet of white roses that smelled so strong they almost made me dizzy. We looked like strangers posing for a magazine article about successful families. After the ceremony, he drove me to the estate himself. The entire ride lasted 40 minutes, and during that time he spoke only once, his voice steady as he kept his eyes on the long highway ahead. He said that our arrangement would be respectful and uncomplicated, that I would have every comfort the house could offer, and that his work would require long hours away from home. Then he added one final sentence that I did not fully understand at the time. He said it was important that neither of us expect something the other person could not give. I remember nodding, pretending that I understood exactly what he meant, even though part of me still believed that time could change people. That belief followed me through the first weeks in the house as I learned where everything belonged, as I memorized the quiet routines of the staff, and as I watched Adrian move through the halls with the calm authority of someone who carried an entire world on his shoulders. He was never unkind to me. That was the strange part. He greeted me politely when we crossed paths in the morning, asked whether I needed anything when the staff prepared dinner, and once even thanked me for organizing a charity event his foundation supported. But there was always distance in his voice, like the invisible space between two people sitting across a long conference table. At night his office light often stayed on until well past midnight, a narrow beam glowing beneath the door at the end of the hallway, and sometimes I would pause there for a moment before returning to my room, wondering what it might be like if that door ever opened and he invited me inside not as an obligation, but as someone he truly wanted beside him. I discovered that silence can hide many things inside a house as large as the Blake estate. It hides footsteps, quiet conversations behind closed doors, and sometimes it hides a person who tries very hard not to disturb the world around her. That person was me. After the first few weeks, I understood something important about Adrian Blake's life. Everything around him moved with purpose. Every phone call, every visitor, every car that rolled through the iron gates had a reason. There were meetings in the study, quiet dinners with men in tailored suits, and long nights when the glow from his office door stretched across the hallway like a thin line of light that never seemed to fade. I learned not to interrupt that rhythm. Instead, I filled the empty spaces with small things that made the house feel less like a fortress and more like a home. The housekeeper, Mrs. Dalton, had been working there for almost 15 years. She moved slowly now because her knees bothered her during the colder months, so I began helping her organize the linen closets in the mornings. We would fold towels together near the tall window overlooking the north garden while she told stories about the early days of the estate, back when Adrian's father had still been alive and the halls were filled with laughter from holiday gatherings. Down in the kitchen, I started arriving early enough to help the chef prepare breakfast for the staff. Nothing complicated, just slicing fruit, arranging plates, and making sure the coffee was ready before the drivers and security team finished their first shift. At first, everyone looked surprised to see me there, as if they expected the woman who married Adrian Blake to live behind closed doors and never appear in the staff wing of the house. But people relax when they realize you are not there to supervise them. They relax when you ask about their children or remember how they take their coffee. Slowly the house began to change in small ways. The gardener started leaving fresh flowers near the staircase every Monday morning. Mrs. Dalton began humming softly while she worked. Even the security team at the gate started greeting me with warm smiles instead of formal nods when I walked across the front lawn in the afternoon sun. Adrian never commented on any of it. Sometimes he would pass through the kitchen on his way to the garage, his jacket draped neatly over one arm while he spoke quietly on the phone. Other times he would step into the dining room late in the evening when I was finishing dinner, his presence filling the room before he even spoke. Our conversations were always brief. He would ask whether the house was running smoothly or whether the charity foundation had sent any updates about the upcoming event in the city. I would answer politely, careful not to hold his attention longer than necessary. Still, there were moments when I noticed something change in his expression, something subtle that disappeared almost as quickly as it appeared. One evening near the end of September, I was sitting at the long dining table with a stack of invitation cards for the charity gala his company sponsored every fall. The windows were open and the warm air carried the scent of cut grass from the lawn outside. Adrian walked into the room quietly, pausing near the doorway when he saw the cards spread across the table. For a moment he did not say anything. He simply watched as I tied the final ribbon around a stack of envelopes addressed to local hospitals and community centers that depended on the foundation's donations every year. When I finally looked up, I noticed that familiar distance in his eyes, the same calm reserve he always carried like armor. But this time there was something else behind it, something thoughtful. He picked up one of the envelopes and examined the handwriting carefully before setting it back down. Then he spoke in that steady voice that never revealed too much. He said the invitations looked professional and thanked me for organizing them. It was a small moment, barely more than a sentence, but as he turned and walked back toward the hallway, I realized something quietly surprising. For the first time since arriving at the estate, Adrian Blake had noticed something I did. I began to understand that the world surrounding Adrian Blake moved far beyond the quiet walls of the estate. At first the signs were subtle, small shifts in routine that most people would probably never notice. Black cars arriving earlier in the evening. Security radios murmuring softly near the front gate. The low glow of lights in Adrian's study lasting longer into the night. Autumn had settled over the property by then, the trees along the long driveway turning shades of amber and deep red that scattered across the stone paths like pieces of stained glass. The air smelled cooler, carrying the faint scent of wood smoke from neighboring estates across the hills. It was beautiful in a calm and distant way, the kind of scenery people drove miles to photograph, but inside the house the atmosphere had changed. I noticed it first during breakfast one Monday morning when two unfamiliar men sat across from Adrian at the far end of the dining room table. They wore dark suits and spoke quietly, their voices low enough that I could not hear the words from where I stood near the kitchen doorway. Adrian listened more than he spoke, his posture relaxed, but attentive, one hand resting lightly beside a folder filled with printed documents. When their conversation ended, the men left without finishing their coffee, and Adrian remained at the table for several minutes afterward staring at the papers as if they contained something complicated that required careful thought. He did not notice that I was watching from the hallway until he finally stood and gathered the documents into a neat stack. When his eyes met mine, the expression on his face shifted quickly back to that familiar calm distance. He told me he would be in the city most of the day and asked if the invitations for the charity gala had been delivered to the courier service yet. I assured him that they had gone out that morning. He nodded once and walked toward the front door where his driver was already waiting beside the black sedan. Moments like that happened more often as the weeks passed. Adrian's schedule grew busier, and the quiet meetings in his study became longer and more frequent. Sometimes the voices inside the room sounded tense, not loud, but sharper than usual, like people trying to solve a problem that refused to disappear. The staff felt it too. Mrs. Dalton began double-checking the locks on the garden doors every evening, and the security team added an extra patrol vehicle near the west gate after sunset. No one explained the reason for the changes, but the atmosphere carried a subtle tension that lingered in the halls long after midnight. One afternoon, I walked across the front lawn toward the small greenhouse near the edge of the property where the gardener kept winter plants protected from the cold. The sky was clear and bright, stretching wide above the rolling hills beyond the estate walls, and for a moment the world felt peaceful again. I was kneeling beside a row of young rose bushes when I heard the distant rumble of an engine approaching the gate. Another black vehicle rolled slowly through the entrance before disappearing down the curved driveway lined with tall oak trees. That alone was not unusual. Cars arrived often, but something about the timing made me pause. Adrian was not expected home for several more hours, and the driver of the vehicle stepped out looking around the property with careful attention before speaking into a small radio clipped to his jacket. I watched from the greenhouse window as he walked toward the main house with steady steps, his posture alert in a way that suggested he was not simply visiting for an ordinary meeting. A quiet uneasiness settled in my chest as I stood and brushed the soil from my hands. The estate had always felt secure, almost isolated from the outside world. But that afternoon I sensed something shifting beyond the gates, something invisible but growing closer with every passing day, like a storm forming somewhere just beyond the horizon. I realized the estate had changed the moment the sun disappeared behind the tall oak trees and the evening lights came on earlier than usual. Normally the house carried a calm rhythm after dinner, the quiet clink of dishes in the kitchen, the distant hum of security vehicles passing slowly beyond the gates, and sometimes the soft music Mrs. Dalton liked to play while folding linens in the laundry room. But that night everything felt sharper, more alert, as if the house itself had begun listening. I was in the dining room organizing the final seating cards for the charity gala when the front doors opened with a firm echo that carried through the marble hallway. Adrian stepped inside first, his dark coat draped over one arm, his expression composed but thoughtful in the way it often became after long days in the city. Two men followed him into the foyer, both dressed in tailored suits that suggested they had come straight from business meetings. Their voices were low as they spoke to him, the conversation quiet but urgent in tone. I could not hear the words from where I sat, but I saw the way Adrian listened carefully before answering, his eyes narrowing slightly as he considered whatever information they were sharing. After a few moments he nodded once, the kind of decisive movement that meant the conversation had reached its conclusion. The men left quickly, their car disappearing down the long driveway only minutes later. Adrian remained standing in the foyer for a moment after the doors closed behind them. Then he turned and walked toward the dining room, where the warm light from the chandelier spilled across the polished table. He paused when he saw the stacks of cards arranged neatly in front of me. For a second, he looked almost surprised that I was still awake. I explained that the courier would arrive early in the morning to collect the final invitations for the gala. He listened quietly, his attention lingering on the table before shifting toward the tall windows overlooking the dark lawn outside. The night beyond the glass looked calm, the distant lights along the perimeter fence glowing steadily in the cool autumn air. Still, something in his posture had changed. There was tension in the way his shoulders held still, like a man carefully measuring the distance between two moving pieces on a chessboard. He asked whether I had noticed anything unusual around the property that afternoon. The question caught me off guard. I hesitated for a moment before telling him about the unfamiliar vehicle that had arrived earlier while I was near the greenhouse. His expression did not change much, but I saw the quick flicker of attention in his eyes, the way someone reacts when a small detail confirms a larger concern. He thanked me for mentioning it and walked toward the study at the end of the hall, his steps slow and deliberate across the marble floor. A few minutes later the office door closed quietly behind him. The narrow line of light beneath the door appeared soon afterward, stretching across the hallway carpet as it had on so many nights before. I finished arranging the cards and carried them carefully toward the front desk near the entrance so the staff would remember to send them with the courier in the morning. As I turned off the dining room lights, I noticed movement outside the window, one of the security vehicles making another slow pass along the edge of the lawn. The headlights glided across the trees before disappearing again into the darkness near the west gate. I stood there for a moment watching the quiet property beyond the glass, trying to ignore the uneasy feeling that had settled in my chest earlier that afternoon. The estate had always felt like a place removed from the rest of the world, protected by distance and quiet authority. But that night the calm felt thinner somehow, like the fragile stillness that comes before heavy rain. And although the sky above the hills remained perfectly clear, I could not shake the sense that something beyond those distant gates had already begun moving toward us. The house did not sleep that night, even though the lights eventually dimmed and the hallways grew quiet. I could feel it in the air the moment I woke before sunrise. The estate always carried a peaceful stillness at that hour, the sky pale gray above the distant hills, and the lawn covered with a thin layer of dew that shimmered when the first light touched it. Usually the morning felt calm, like the world was pausing for a breath before the day began. But that morning something felt different. I stepped out into the hallway and noticed that the narrow line of light beneath Adrian's study door was still there. It had not faded during the night. I hesitated for a moment before walking toward the kitchen, passing the closed office door with quiet steps. Inside the kitchen, the staff had just begun arriving. The chef was pouring coffee into a row of white mugs while Mrs. Dalton arranged fresh towels beside the sink. Everyone moved with the same quiet efficiency as always, yet I noticed how often their eyes drifted toward the hallway leading to Adrian's office. Even they could sense the tension lingering in the house. I poured a cup of tea and carried it toward the tall window overlooking the driveway. The sky was slowly brightening now, soft light stretching across the long path that curved toward the iron gates at the edge of the property. A security vehicle rolled slowly past the entrance, its headlights still on even though the sun was beginning to rise. I wrapped my hands around the warm cup and watched the quiet movement outside, thinking about the question Adrian had asked the night before. Had I noticed anything unusual? The words echoed in my mind with a weight that had not been there before. A few minutes later, I heard footsteps behind me. Adrian entered the kitchen without his jacket, his white shirt sleeves rolled neatly to his forearms as if he had been working all night. His hair was slightly disheveled in a way I had never seen before, and there was a faint shadow of exhaustion beneath his eyes. Still, his posture remained composed, the same quiet authority surrounding him even in the early morning light. He nodded politely to the staff before pouring himself a cup of coffee. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The kitchen window reflected both of us standing there, two figures sharing the same quiet space, yet separated by something invisible and familiar. Finally, he turned toward me and asked whether I had slept well. The question sounded simple, but there was a careful attention behind it, as if he were measuring my reaction. I told him that I had slept fine. That part was not entirely true. The uneasy feeling from the night before had followed me into my dreams, leaving a faint tension that lingered even now. Adrian studied my expression for a moment before nodding slightly. He thanked me again for telling him about the vehicle near the greenhouse. Then he added that the security team would be increasing patrols around the property for the next few days. He said it calmly, the same way someone might mention that rain was expected later in the afternoon. But something about the way he held the coffee cup in his hand revealed that the situation meant more than a simple precaution. Outside the window, the rising sun illuminated the wide lawn and the quiet trees beyond the fence. Everything looked peaceful, untouched by worry. Yet as Adrian turned to leave the kitchen and walk back toward the hallway, I realized that the estate no longer felt like the safe and distant place it once had. Something unseen had entered the quiet rhythm of our lives. And even though the morning looked perfectly ordinary, I could not ignore the growing sense that the calm around us was beginning to fracture, one quiet moment at a time. The days that followed moved forward with a strange balance between routine and quiet tension, like a clock that continued ticking even while something unseen pressed gently against the glass. From the outside, nothing appeared different. The estate still stood calm beneath the wide autumn sky. The long driveway still lined with trees that dropped amber leaves across the stone path every afternoon, and the distant hills still glowed gold when the sun lowered toward the horizon. Yet inside the gates the atmosphere had shifted in ways that were impossible to ignore. The security vehicles passed more often now, their slow patrols circling the property every hour instead of every few hours. New cameras appeared near the back garden entrance, small black lenses that blended carefully into the corners of the stone walls. Even the staff felt the change. Conversations in the kitchen grew quieter whenever someone mentioned Adrian's meetings or the unfamiliar visitors arriving through the gates. Adrian himself became more difficult to predict. Some mornings he left before the sun fully cleared the hills, his car disappearing down the long road while the lawn was still silver with dew. Other nights he remained in his study long after midnight, the narrow line of light beneath the door stretching across the hallway carpet like a silent signal that the day had not truly ended. Still, he carried himself with the same calm composure whenever we crossed paths. If the pressure surrounding him had grown heavier, he refused to show it openly. One afternoon near the end of the week, I was walking through the back garden carrying a small basket of fresh roses that the gardener had cut from the greenhouse. The air was cool and bright, the kind of autumn afternoon that made the entire property feel peaceful again. For a few moments, I almost believed the tension of the past days had been nothing more than imagination. Then I heard the familiar sound of gravel shifting beneath tires near the far gate. I turned toward the driveway, just as a dark vehicle rolled slowly through the entrance. It was not one of the estate security cars. The shape was different, the polished black exterior reflecting the pale sunlight as it moved toward the main house. The driver stepped out first, scanning the property with a calm but deliberate gaze before opening the rear door. A tall man emerged from the car wearing a charcoal coat and gloves despite the mild temperature. He paused beside the vehicle and looked around the grounds in a way that made the air feel slightly colder. Even from the distance of the garden path, I could sense the quiet authority in the way he carried himself, the kind of presence that made people instinctively lower their voices when he entered a room. One of the security guards approached him quickly and spoke into his radio. Within seconds, the front doors of the house opened, and Adrian stepped outside onto the stone terrace. The moment his eyes landed on the visitor, his expression changed in a way I had never seen before. Not fear. Adrian Blake was not a man who feared easily, but something sharper moved across his face, something alert and calculating, like a chess player recognizing an opponent who had finally revealed his first real move. I stood still beside the rose bushes, watching from the edge of the garden as the two men faced each other across the terrace. Their conversation was quiet and brief, carried away by the breeze before the words could reach me. After only a minute, Adrian gestured toward the front doors, and the visitor followed him inside. The heavy doors closed slowly behind them, leaving the terrace empty again beneath the pale sky. I remained there for several seconds, the basket of roses resting against my arm while the wind stirred the leaves across the stone path. Somewhere deep inside the house, a new chapter of Adrian Blake's world had just begun unfolding. And although I could not hear the conversation behind those walls, I understood one thing with sudden clarity. Whatever had been approaching the estate over the past few days had finally arrived. I remained in the garden long after the front doors closed behind Adrian and the visitor, the basket of roses resting against my arm while the wind moved softly through the branches above me. The sky had begun turning pale gray again as thin clouds drifted across the afternoon sun, dimming the bright light that had filled the property only minutes earlier. Something about the air felt heavier now, as if the quiet beauty of the estate had shifted into something more watchful. I finally carried the roses back toward the house, stepping through the tall glass doors that opened into the back hallway near the kitchen. Inside, the atmosphere had changed in the same subtle way. The staff moved carefully through their routines, but conversations were quieter than usual. Mrs. Dalton glanced up when she saw me enter, her expression warm but distracted, as though she too sensed that something important was happening somewhere beyond the kitchen walls. I placed the roses in a vase near the window and asked whether Adrian had returned to his study. She nodded and said that he and the visitor had gone directly there after entering the house. The door had remained closed ever since. The study sat at the far end of the main hallway, a large room with tall shelves and dark wood panels that seemed to absorb every sound that passed through the corridor. Normally, I would not have walked in that direction without a reason. Adrian valued his privacy when it came to work, and I had learned early that the quiet distance between us was easier to maintain than to challenge. But that afternoon curiosity moved my steps forward before I could stop myself. I walked slowly down the long hallway, the soft carpet muffling each footstep until I reached the corner where the study door stood closed beneath a wall lamp that cast warm light across the polished handle. I did not intend to listen. At least that is what I told myself. I only wanted to confirm that the meeting was still happening. Yet as I paused near the door, I heard Adrian's voice from inside the room, calm but firmer than usual, carrying the careful control he used when conversations required precision. The visitor responded in a lower tone that sounded unfamiliar and slightly accented. I could not understand every word, but a few phrases reached me clearly enough to make my breath catch. They spoke about agreements, about territories, about a situation in the city that had become more complicated than expected. The visitor mentioned the estate by name. That alone was enough to send a chill through me. Adrian's answer came immediately, his voice steady and unyielding. He said that the estate was not part of any negotiation. There was a long pause after that statement, the kind of silence that hangs in the air when two people are deciding how far they are willing to push each other. I realized then that my hand had tightened slightly around the edge of the hallway table beside me. Whatever was unfolding behind that door was larger than a simple business discussion. It was something that reached beyond the city offices and meeting rooms where Adrian usually handled his affairs. The visitor spoke again, his tone quieter this time, and I heard Adrian respond with a final sentence that carried the weight of a decision already made. He said that certain boundaries were not open for discussion. A chair shifted inside the room and footsteps moved toward the door. My heart jumped into my throat. I stepped back quickly and walked down the hallway before the handle turned, trying to appear as though I had only been passing through. A moment later the study door opened behind me, and the visitor walked past with calm, measured steps. As he passed, his eyes moved briefly toward me, studying my face with quiet curiosity before he continued down the hall toward the front entrance. Adrian remained standing in the doorway of the study, watching the man leave. When his gaze finally shifted toward me, I noticed the same thoughtful tension I had seen earlier on the terrace. For a brief second our eyes met across the hallway. Then he spoke in a voice that sounded calm, but carried a weight I had never heard before. He said that the house would be under additional protection for a while. And although he did not explain the reason, I understood that the quiet world surrounding Adrian Blake had just grown far more complicated than I had ever imagined. I did not realize how much a single sentence could change the air inside a house until Adrian said the estate would be under additional protection. He spoke quietly, almost casually, yet the words lingered in the hallway long after the visitor's car disappeared down the curved driveway. The front doors closed with a heavy echo, and the familiar quiet returned, but it was no longer the same quiet I had grown used to during the past months. It felt tighter now, like the walls themselves were listening. Adrian remained standing near the study doorway for a moment after the visitor left, his gaze fixed toward the entrance, as if measuring something far beyond the iron gates. The late afternoon sun filtered through the tall windows behind him, casting long shadows across the marble floor. I noticed the faint crease between his brows, the same thoughtful tension that had appeared earlier on the terrace. It was the expression of a man carrying a decision that could not easily be undone. After a moment, he turned back toward his office and gathered a few documents from the desk before closing the folder with calm precision. Review. He nodded once, satisfied, then walked slowly beside me down the hallway toward the main staircase. For the first time since our marriage began, the silence between us felt heavier than usual. Outside, another security vehicle passed along the edge of the lawn, its headlights sweeping briefly across the tall windows before fading into the trees again. Adrian noticed it too. His eyes followed the movement for a second before returning to the quiet interior of the house. Finally, he spoke again, this time with a tone that carried more weight than the earlier conversation. He said that the next few days might require certain adjustments to the household routine. Additional security personnel would remain on the property, and visitors would be limited until further notice. He explained it in the same calm voice he used when discussing business schedules, but I sensed that this change was not temporary in the ordinary sense. Something had shifted beyond the estate walls, something that now reached directly into Adrian Blake's world. I asked whether the situation involved the visitor from earlier. Adrian paused briefly on the staircase, his hand resting on the polished railing as he considered the question. For a moment I thought he might refuse to answer, beginning to stand at the edge of something far more uncertain than I had ever imagined. I began to notice that Adrian Blake was changing, although the transformation was so quiet that most people inside the house would never have recognized it. The estate continued to move with the same outward rhythm. Security vehicles patrolled the gates more frequently. Unfamiliar guards appeared near the back garden entrances, and new cameras had been installed along the stone wall overlooking the lower fields. Yet inside the house something subtler was unfolding. Adrian had always carried himself with controlled distance, the kind of quiet authority that kept the world at arm's length. But after the visitor arrived and the conversations in his study grew more serious, that distance began shifting in small, unexpected ways. It started the next morning when I was arranging fresh flowers in the dining room before breakfast. The sun had just begun lighting the tall windows when Adrian entered from the hallway, already dressed for the day, his dark jacket hanging neatly over his arm. Normally, he would nod politely and continue toward the front entrance where his driver waited. That morning he stopped beside the table and looked at the flowers for several seconds. They were simple white roses from the greenhouse, arranged in a clear vase near the center of the polished wood. I explained that the gardener had cut them early that morning before the temperature dropped. Adrian listened quietly, then said that the dining room looked brighter with them there. The comment was brief, almost casual, but it lingered with me long after he left the room. It was the first time he had noticed something inside the house that had nothing to do with business or schedules. Over the next few days, similar moments appeared like small cracks in a wall that had always seemed solid. One afternoon, he returned earlier than expected and found me organizing the library shelves that lined the west wing of the house. The tall windows there overlooked the distant hills, and the late sunlight filled the room with warm gold light that turned the dark wood panels almost amber. Adrian paused in the doorway and asked whether I had been reading the books or simply arranging them. I told him, ran his hand slowly along the edge of one shelf, as if remembering something from another time. For a moment his usual composure softened, and I realized that this room carried memories he rarely spoke about. He did not stay long, but before leaving he asked whether I would recommend any of the books. The question surprised me enough that I laughed quietly before suggesting one about early American cities that I had been reading during the evenings. Adrian nodded thoughtfully, then said he might borrow it after finishing his work. That evening I placed the book on the small table near his study door without saying anything. Later that night, when I walked down the hallway on my way to my room, the book was gone. The next morning it sat neatly on his desk beside a stack of documents. He tried to hide it with the same composed posture he always maintained. He placed his jacket over the back of one chair and looked toward the stack of event folders spread across the table. I explained that the final seating arrangements had been completed and that the foundation representatives had confirmed their attendance. First time since the conversation began. When I finished speaking, he remained silent for several seconds before finally saying something that surprised me more than anything else that evening. He said that perhaps the estate had needed someone who understood those things better than he ever had. The statement was simple, yet the meaning behind it lingered in the air long after he stood up from the table. As Adrian walked toward the hallway, he paused near the doorway and looked back once more at the quiet dining room. For the first time since I had known him, there was something almost uncertain in his expression, as though the carefully controlled world he had built around himself was beginning to shift in ways he had not expected. That night the estate was unusually quiet, the kind of quiet that made every small sound seem sharper than it really was. The charity gala was only 2 days away, and most of the house had finally settled after a long afternoon of preparations. I had just finished reviewing the final guest confirmations when I noticed the familiar glow of light beneath Adrian's study door again. It had become a pattern over the past weeks. While the rest of the house slept, Adrian often remained awake long after midnight, surrounded by documents, quiet phone calls, and decisions that never fully revealed themselves to the world outside those walls. I walked slowly down the hallway with the last folder of gala notes in my hand, intending to place it on the small table outside his office so he could review it in the morning. But when I reached the door, I paused. His voice drifted softly from inside the room. It was not the sharp tone he used during business meetings. It sounded lower, more reflective, as though he were speaking to someone he trusted. After a moment I realized he was not speaking to anyone at all. He was reading something quietly to himself, perhaps reviewing one of the documents on his desk. I placed the folder carefully beside the door and turned to leave, but the floorboard beneath my step creaked softly. The sound was small, yet it carried through the hallway like a whisper. The study door opened a second later. Adrian stood there with one hand resting against the frame, the warm light from the office falling across the hallway. Carpet. For a moment neither of us spoke. His eyes moved briefly toward the folder on the table before returning to me. Time since the night I overheard his cold words months ago, I sensed that the distance he once insisted on keeping between us was beginning to fade. The night before the charity gala arrived with a calm that felt almost unreal after everything that had happened inside the quiet walls of the estate. The sky above the hills was clear and wide, scattered with stars that reflected faintly in the tall windows lining the main hallway. Inside the house, the final preparations had been completed. Staff members moved through the rooms, placing fresh flowers along the staircase, adjusting table settings, and reviewing the schedule for the next evening's event. From the outside, everything looked perfect, the kind of elegant calm people expected from the home of Adrian Blake. Yet for me, the house felt different now, not because the tension beyond the gates had disappeared, but because something inside these walls had quietly changed. I was standing near the large window overlooking the front lawn when I noticed Adrian stepping onto the stone terrace outside. He had removed his jacket and rolled up his sleeves, the cool night air moving softly across the open space. For a moment, he simply stood there looking toward the distant security lights along the fence, the same lights that had once made the estate feel isolated from the rest of the world. I walked outside and joined him on the terrace. Kitchen, the evenings spent organizing charity programs, and the small moments that filled the house with life, he had begun to see the estate differently. It was no longer just a place to protect or manage.